Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. This is the Colonial battle for North America. Nations at War timeline. I did the first video some time ago. I don't know, 3 weeks ago. I just keep forgetting to get around to do it, to finish it. So I'm going to go ahead and do this one. Probably about the 28-29 minute mark. All the video. I'll call it apart. So, just go ahead and get in the video.
Had for generations, the Highlanders carried swords into battle. These basket-hilted blades were perfect for slashing and stabbing, while the hilt and pommel could crack an enemy's skull. Equally deadly with the bayonet, Highlanders were the only British units truly prepared for close combat. However, these elite soldiers weren't enough for Geoffrey Amherst. He planned to win at any cost. Smallpox had killed millions of indigenous people not long after first contact with Europeans. Now, Amherst and his commanders considered using it as a weapon. At Fort Pitt, the British gave pox-ridden blankets to one of Guyasuta's peace envoys.
The British. I know Americans did it. We catch hell for it. I don't hear the British catching hell for it. Just saying.
Hoping it would spread and wipe their enemy out.
Well, Geoffrey Amherst, I mean, if we were to...
What the hell's going on? Jesus Christ, what's happening?
Geoffrey Amherst, I mean, if we were to apply standards of today, the standards of warfare, he would definitely be considered a war criminal.
The biological attack killed countless people, but it didn't break Guyasuta's siege. It would be up to the British Army to end the war. Unfortunately for the British, Pontiac and Guyasuta knew their enemy was coming. On July 31st, the British column under Dalyell attacked Pontiac's camp. They ran straight into an Ottawa ambush. Dalyell and 19 of his men were killed. Robert Rogers spared the rest by leading a fighting retreat. On August 5th, Guyasuta made his move. They ambushed Bouquet's column at a place now called Bushy Run. However, this time, the British didn't retreat. Bouquet's men held their ground until nightfall. By daybreak, the fighting resumed at a fevered pitch. Every time the British advanced, the warriors scattered and regrouped, so Bouquet laid a trap for his enemy by deliberately weakening a portion of his line. Convinced that the British were retreating, Guyasuta's warriors charged en masse. They ran straight into a hail of musket fire. Then the Highlanders rose from their positions and charged, hacking down the warriors with swords and bayonets. After suffering heavy losses, the warriors pulled back. The Battle of Bushy Run was over. This defeat forced Guyasuta to abandon his siege and shook the confidence of the First Nations. However, Amherst's victory on the battlefield would be undercut by a political defeat. While Amherst was busy provoking a war, Sir William Johnson had complained about his conduct to London. As Britain's top diplomat to the First Nations, his word carried weight. Amherst was recalled to London, though the government tried to save face by honoring him for his service to the Empire. He was quietly removed from command. His replacement, Thomas Gage, wasn't much better, but he did see the value in letting Johnson negotiate peace. As 1764 began, Gage sent new expeditions into the West with one mission: convince the First Nations to surrender or destroy their means of continuing the war. However, his opponents had learned their lesson from Bushy Run. They avoided open battle and targeted vulnerable outposts and settlements instead. Pontiac's campaign had become a war of atrocity, and he was losing ground by the day. When Gage and Johnson convinced the Seneca to switch sides, the coalition in the Ohio shattered. Realizing further fighting was hopeless, Guyasuta surrendered by October of 1764, taking the Ohio Country nations out of the war. While Pontiac remained undefeated, he was short on supplies and ammunition. News of Guyasuta's surrender struck a mortal blow to his coalition. The Potawatomi, Wendat, Wabash, and Miami made separate peaces with Johnson. By 1765, only scattered pockets of Ottawa and Ojibwe were still fighting. Pontiac abandoned his siege and led his remaining supporters deep into the wilderness. Pontiac's warriors could no longer achieve victory, but the British had no hope of hunting him down in his own land. Pontiac held out for another year before he agreed to negotiate. At Fort Ontario, he and William Johnson finally ended the conflict which history would call Pontiac's War. Though Pontiac had been one of many leaders, his courage and charisma were central to binding the movement into a single force. And his efforts showed how powerful the First Nations could be when they worked together. After he was murdered in 1769 over a personal grudge, Pontiac's legend lived on. Among his defenders was Robert Rogers. Defying the prejudice of his time, Rogers wrote a play which cast Pontiac as a sympathetic hero. Though Pontiac's warriors failed to permanently end British settlement, they had taught the Crown a very bloody lesson. The First Nations would not meekly roll over and let Britain push them aside. Pontiac's memory haunted British officials for a generation. Eager to avoid another war, they pursued a less belligerent strategy to secure control over North America. On October 8, 1763, King George III issued a royal proclamation asserting his claim to North America. The proclamation also contained the King's olive branch to the First Nations.
The royal proclamation itself is obviously a colonial assertion, because it doesn't say that the Crown respects in a nation-to-nation relationship.
The lands west of the Appalachian Mountains would be off-limits to American settlers. It was hoped this gesture would prevent another leader like Pontiac from emerging. The borders of this artificial indigenous homeland were sketched out in Europe without input from the First Nations. The British even gave this territory a name: the Indian Reserve. In 1750, Eastern North America was a battleground, and the Abenaki Nation are fighting for survival. They are caught between two rival empires. One is an enemy seeking their destruction. The other, an ally fighting a war they don't understand.
Conquer, surrender, victory, defeat. These deadly battles shaped continents. These are nations at war.
For much of its history, Eastern North America was a land where the borders and fates of nations were decided in combat. From skirmishes over grudges and resources, to the decimation of cultures in the name of territory or wealth. The landscape itself serves as a monument to the countless who lay buried and forgotten. One conflict, however, stands out for the way it changed the fate of the First Nations forever. The 7 Years' War. A conflict which began as a dispute between France and Britain over the Ohio Country in 1754, became a global war fought by all of Europe's major powers. Caught between these clashing titans, indigenous nations like the Abenaki fought for themselves. Abenaki territory formed the western frontier of what they called Wabanaki. Roughly translated as the Dawn Land, it referred to not just the land itself, but the people as well. The Dawn Land is home to 5 nations connected by trade, marriage, and related languages. Together they formed a military alliance known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. The Abenaki were one of the first indigenous nations to trade and work with Europeans. North of Abenaki territory were Montreal and Quebec, the fortified heart of a French colony called Canada. While on the east coast, the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and French built a hybrid society known as Acadia. Though the French made grandiose claims of authority over the Abenaki, the colonial officials knew the truth. The French needed the Abenaki to guard the core of their territory from 2 dangerous rivals, the Iroquois Confederacy and Britain's American colonies.
So the Abenaki are effectively settled along the border between New France and the expanding territory of the 5 nations Iroquois. Thus, the Abenaki play a role as sort of frontline soldiers, frontline warriors against this expanding territorial empire.
French.
So they're caught in the middle of something. I like that painting.
Traders and diplomats worked hard to win Abenaki allies, lavishing their chiefs with gifts and arming their warriors with guns and steel. Binding the Abenaki even tighter to the French alliance was the presence of the Jesuits. This arm of the Catholic Church lived among the Abenaki, building missions and settlements.
The Jesuits were very much at the forefront of expanding the French Empire because of their mission to bring the Word of God to the native people who had no tradition in that religion. So they're sometimes called the shock troops of Jesus.
The Jesuits served as France's middleman and intelligence agents among the First Nations. Although the Abenaki undoubtedly benefited from the traders and priests, their presence came at an unforeseen price. Before European contact, there were an estimated 30 to 40,000 Abenaki. By 1754, however, European diseases and wars had reduced their population by as much as 85%.
They were not a large nation, large people to start with, and then they got smaller and smaller until there was very, very few of them remaining.
The Abenaki were now forced to rely heavily on their French allies. In the name of keeping the alliance strong, they feigned respect for France's imperial pretensions and stroked their egos by calling them father. It was a sign of respect many Frenchmen mistook for submission. Whatever their differences with France, the Abenaki had close ties with the French Canadians. Never more than 100,000 in number, they worked and hunted alongside the Abenaki. French Canadians learned to fight as their First Nations allies did, and became feared as guerrilla fighters in their own right. Both peoples suffered at the hands of the British and their Iroquois allies. As 1754 began, both stood to lose everything to British expansion. The final showdown between Britain and France had begun, and the Abenaki would have to fight for everything they held dear. It's 1754, and battles are raging across.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it and go back to that last, because that was a nice little cut there. And go ahead and stop the video here. And then I'll come back and I'll knock this one out. It's been good. So I'm going to end this right here. You got to like and subscribe to the video. Otherwise, your hippopotamus pet will eat your feet in the middle of the night. And no one wants that. So, have a good day, have a good night.